It's 3:47 a.m. on a moonless night in Sinaloa, Mexico. The freight yards are eerily quiet except for the distant rumble of diesel engines. Workers in reflective vests move between the massive steel rail cars, checking manifests and securing cargo. But hidden among them are others, men who don't belong, carrying welding torches and power tools. They work quickly, methodically, cutting into the structural beams of a grain hopper destined for Texas. Within hours, this train will cross the border carrying its hidden payload, hundreds of pounds of pure Colombian cocaine worth millions on American streets. This isn't just another smuggling operation. This is the Ghost Train Network, a sophisticated cartel infrastructure that turns America's own freight rail system into the largest drug pipeline you've never heard of. Every year, over 8,000 trains cross the US-Mexico border through just 8 crossing points. Each one represents an opportunity for Mexican cartels to move massive quantities of drugs directly into the heart of America. The Sinaloa cartel and Jalisco New Generation cartel have transformed these legitimate freight operations into something far more sinister. They've weaponized an entire transportation network, turning everyday rail cars into high-tech smuggling vessels that can carry more drugs in a single trip than dozens of border tunnels combined. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. American railroad companies are being held financially responsible for every ounce of drugs that crosses the border in their cars. Union Pacific alone faces over $388 million in fines, money they refuse to pay because they claim they can't control what happens to their trains on Mexican soil. The federal government disagrees, and this battle is costing American taxpayers hundreds of millions while drugs continue flowing north at an unprecedented rate. Tonight, we're going deep inside the Ghost Train Network. We'll show you exactly how cartels have infiltrated America's freight system, the ingenious methods they use to hide drugs inside rail cars, and why this smuggling operation represents the most significant threat to border security that most Americans have never heard of. We'll reveal classified seizure data, expose the financial warfare between railroad companies and the federal government, and uncover how a 1930s law is being used to fine American companies for crimes committed by Mexican cartels. This investigation took months to piece together. We analyzed federal court documents, customs seizure reports, and internal railroad communications. We spoke with former cartel associates, border patrol agents, and railroad security officials who revealed the shocking scope of this operation. What we discovered will change how you think about the drug war forever. Mexican cartels earn an estimated $25 billion annually from drug sales in the United States. That's more than the GDP of some countries. And increasingly, those drugs are arriving not through tunnels or hidden in cars, but aboard America's freight trains. The numbers are staggering. Thousands of pounds of cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl cross the border by rail every single month. But this isn't just about drugs. It's about how criminal organizations have systematically infiltrated and weaponized critical American infrastructure. The same trains that carry grain from America's heartland to Mexico return loaded with death. The same rail yards where American workers load legitimate cargo become staging areas for cartel operations that fund violence across 2 nations. The cartels didn't stumble into this by accident. This represents years of planning, intelligence gathering, and coordination between some of the most sophisticated criminal organizations on Earth. They've studied American freight operations, identified vulnerabilities, and developed countermeasures for every security system we've deployed against them. Here's how deep this goes. Cartel operatives have infiltrated rail yards on both sides of the border. They know which trains are scheduled to cross, which cars offer the best concealment opportunities, and which routes face the least scrutiny. They've developed their own graffiti tagging systems to mark cars containing drugs, ensuring their associates in American cities can identify and retrieve their shipments. The modification techniques they use are nothing short of engineering marvels. Cartels employ skilled welders who can cut into a rail car's structural beams, create hidden compartments, and weld everything back together so perfectly that visual inspection reveals nothing. They've developed false floors, fake axle housings, and hollow compartments that can hold hundreds of pounds of drugs while still allowing the train to function normally. Some operations are even more brazen. Cartel associates will actually stop moving trains by sabotaging safety equipment, quickly load their drugs, and send the train on its way before anyone notices. They've turned America's freight rail system into their personal delivery service. The scope of these operations became clear in March when Mexican Army officials, working with American intelligence, seized 350 tons of marijuana from just 2 tank cars. That's not a typo. Over 1,000 tons of drugs in a single bust. This seizure revealed that cartels aren't just hiding drugs in trains, they're converting entire rail cars into mobile drug warehouses. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. The American government's response has been to fine railroad companies hundreds of millions of dollars for drugs they didn't know were there, placed by criminals they can't control, in a country where they have no authority to provide security. Under a 1930 law originally designed to ensure accurate shipping manifests, customs officials can fine transportation companies $500 per ounce of marijuana and $1,000 per ounce of cocaine or heroin found in their cargo. This law was never intended to deal with sophisticated cartel smuggling operations, but it's being used to hold American companies financially responsible for Mexican crimes. Union Pacific, America's largest railroad company operating on the Mexican border, has been hit hardest. Their fines have exploded from $37.5 million 3 years ago to over $388 million today. The company has filed federal lawsuits arguing they're being punished for something beyond their control. They point out that sending unarmed personnel into Mexico to battle drug cartels would be suicide, but the federal government maintains that railroad companies, particularly Union Pacific, which owns 26% of Mexico's Ferromex Railroad, have enough influence and presence in Mexico to prevent cartel infiltration. This legal battle has created a bizarre situation where American companies are being fined hundreds of millions for failing to stop Mexican criminals from committing crimes in Mexico. Meanwhile, the drugs keep flowing. Every day, dozens of trains cross from Mexico into Texas, California, and Arizona. Each one passes through increasingly sophisticated screening systems that use X-ray technology to peer inside rail cars. But the cartels have adapted, developing new concealment methods faster than security systems can detect them. The X-ray images tell the story. When customs agents screen a normal rail car, they see clean structural lines and properly loaded cargo. But when cartels have been at work, the images show anomalies. Extra metal where it shouldn't be, suspicious voids in structural beams, and modifications that shouldn't exist. Drug detection dogs provide another layer of security, but cartels have learned to mask scents using everything from coffee grounds to industrial chemicals. They've studied how these dogs work and developed countermeasures that often fool even the most experienced handlers. The economic impact extends far beyond the drugs themselves. Railroad companies have spent hundreds of millions on security measures, from armed police forces to advanced scanning equipment. Union Pacific alone spends $3.6 million annually on its own police force and has invested another $72.5 million in border security infrastructure. But every security measure creates new opportunities for cartels to profit. When one smuggling method becomes too risky, they simply develop new techniques. When one border crossing becomes too heavily monitored, they shift operations to others. This constant adaptation has turned border security into an expensive game of whack-a-mole that American taxpayers are losing. The human cost is even more devastating. The drugs flowing through these ghost trains fuel America's opioid crisis, which kills over 70,000 Americans annually. Fentanyl, much of it transported by rail, has become the leading cause of death for Americans under 50. Every successful cartel shipment represents thousands of destroyed lives and shattered families. The violence surrounding these operations has escalated dramatically. Railroad workers on both sides of the border face constant threats from cartel operatives who view freight infrastructure as their territory. In Texas, Sheriff Arvin West has documented cases where armed cartel associates engage in violent takeover robberies, shooting at anyone who interferes with their operations. These aren't petty criminals looking for quick cash. Court documents reveal that nearly half the suspects arrested for rail-related drug crimes are Mexican citizens from Sinaloa, the heartland of the cartel that bears the state's name. Every person bringing illicit cargo across the border is connected to or working directly for these massive criminal organizations. The cartels have turned rail theft into a military-style operation. When trains slow down or make scheduled stops, cartel associates climb aboard with bolt cutters and industrial saws. They don't just steal the drugs they've hidden, they also loot legitimate cargo, taking everything from Nike shoes to consumer electronics. Then, in a move that shows their complete disregard for human life, they cut the air brakes on moving trains before jumping off. This sabotage puts every passenger train, freight crew, and community along these rail lines at risk. A train without properly functioning brakes becomes a runaway missile weighing thousands of tons. The fact that cartels are willing to endanger countless innocent lives for profit reveals the true scope of their brutality. But the most disturbing aspect of the ghost train network isn't the violence, it's the intelligence operation behind it. Cartels have developed surveillance networks that rival those of nation-states. They know when specific trains will cross the border, which cars contain the most valuable cargo, and which routes face the least security scrutiny. Scott Carnes, whose company Duos Technologies sells security systems to railroads, describes cartel operatives as very opportunistic with very good intelligence. This isn't accidental. Cartels have spent years mapping American freight operations, identifying vulnerabilities and developing countermeasures for every security system deployed against them. The tagging system they use demonstrates this sophistication. When cartel operatives load drugs into rail cars in Mexico, they mark those cars with specific graffiti that their associates in American cities can recognize. These aren't random gang tags. They're a complex communication system that allows cartels to track shipments across hundreds of miles and multiple jurisdictions. American customs officials have learned to recognize some of these markings, but cartels constantly change their symbols and codes. By the time law enforcement figures out one tagging system, the cartels have already moved to another. It's a constant game of adaptation that puts authorities permanently on the defensive. The Calexico incident perfectly illustrates how sophisticated these operations have become. In 2010, customs agents discovered 9,000 pounds of marijuana hidden in a gondola car at the California border crossing. The drugs weren't just thrown into the car, they were carefully layered under glass, dirt, and wood in 352 individually wrapped packages. This level of organization required extensive planning and coordination. Multiple smuggling cells had to work together to prepare the shipment, modify the rail car, and coordinate with associates in California who would retrieve the drugs. The street value of this single seizure was estimated at $9 million, but it represented just one intercepted shipment out of potentially hundreds that crossed the border successfully. The X-ray image from this seizure looked unusual enough to trigger further inspection, but only barely. Had the cartels been slightly more careful with their concealment methods, this massive drug shipment would have rolled right into Los Angeles undetected. The fact that it required both advanced imaging technology and drug-sniffing dogs to locate the marijuana shows how close these operations come to complete success. Even more concerning is what happens when cartels realize their shipments might be discovered. Rather than abandon their drugs, they've developed contingency plans that involve bypassing security checkpoints entirely. Sheriff West has documented cases where cartel operatives simply walk through the desert to board trains after they've passed customs inspection points. The evidence is everywhere along the rail lines. Cut red plastic security ties littered around the tracks, each stamped with a serial number that once sealed legitimate cargo. These ties represent successful cartel operations that law enforcement never detected. For every seizure that makes headlines, dozens of shipments reach their destinations undetected. Border Patrol agents describe a cat-and-mouse game where cartels constantly probe for weaknesses in security systems. When agents increase patrols at one crossing, smuggling activity shifts to another. When new X-ray technology is deployed, cartels develop new concealment methods. This constant adaptation has turned border security into an arms race that American taxpayers are funding with no clear path to victory. The financial warfare between railroad companies and the federal government has created perverse incentives that actually help cartels. While Union Pacific and other companies battle over who's responsible for stopping cartel operations, the criminals continue using their infrastructure to move drugs. Every month spent in court is another month of successful smuggling operations. The 1930 law being used to fine railroad companies was written in an era when the biggest smuggling concern was avoiding import taxes on legitimate goods. Its authors never imagined sophisticated criminal organizations with billion-dollar revenues systematically infiltrating transportation networks. Yet this antiquated law is now the primary tool being used to combat one of the most advanced smuggling operations in history. Railroad executives argue that holding them responsible for cartel crimes is like fining airlines for terrorist attacks or charging shipping companies for piracy. They maintain that they're victims of criminal activity, not accomplices to it. But federal prosecutors counter that these companies profit from freight operations in Mexico and therefore bear responsibility for securing their cargo. This legal battle has consumed enormous resources that could otherwise be used to actually stop cartel operations. Instead of focusing on detection and prevention, both sides have spent millions on litigation that resolves nothing while drugs continue flowing north. The cartels, meanwhile, have adapted their operations to exploit the confusion and finger-pointing between American authorities and railroad companies. The ghost train network represents something unprecedented in the history of organized crime: the complete infiltration of critical infrastructure by foreign criminal organizations. These aren't just smugglers hiding drugs in cargo. They're sophisticated operators who have weaponized America's freight rail system against itself. Every day this network operates, it grows more sophisticated and more deeply embedded in legitimate transportation infrastructure. The longer it takes American authorities to develop effective countermeasures, the harder it becomes to root out cartel operations without disrupting the flow of legitimate commerce that keeps the American economy functioning. The scope of this infiltration becomes clear when you realize that cartels now treat American freight infrastructure as their own private distribution network. They've created parallel supply chains that mirror legitimate commerce, with the same level of planning and coordination that major corporations use to move products across continents. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the ghost train network is how it's evolving. As border enforcement tightens and other smuggling methods become more dangerous, cartels are doubling down on rail operations. The volume of drugs seized from trains has increased 40% in just the past year, and that represents only the shipments authorities manage to intercept. The cartels have turned America's geographic advantage against itself. The same vast rail network that allows efficient movement of goods across the continent now provides unlimited opportunities for criminal exploitation. With thousands of miles of track and hundreds of crossing points, it's impossible to monitor every train, every car, every potential hiding spot. Intelligence sources reveal that cartels are already planning the next evolution of their operations. They're studying emerging technologies, mapping new routes, and developing countermeasures for security systems that haven't even been deployed yet. While American authorities react to yesterday's smuggling methods, criminal organizations are preparing for tomorrow's opportunities. The financial implications extend far beyond the immediate costs of interdiction and fines. Every successful cartel shipment generates revenue that funds violence, corruption, and expansion of criminal operations on both sides of the border. The billions flowing through these ghost trains don't just disappear into criminal pockets. They fuel a cycle of violence that destabilizes entire regions. American communities along these rail corridors have become unwilling participants in a drug war they never chose to join. Towns that once viewed passing freight trains as symbols of commerce and prosperity now see them as potential threats. Parents worry about their children playing near tracks that might be monitored by cartel operatives. The psychological impact on railroad workers cannot be understated. Engineers and conductors who once viewed their jobs as routine transportation work now understand they might be unknowingly carrying cargo that will destroy American lives. The stress of this knowledge, combined with constant security concerns, has fundamentally changed the culture of an industry that built America. Law enforcement agencies find themselves fighting an enemy that adapts faster than government bureaucracy can respond. By the time new regulations are written, approved, and implemented, cartels have already moved to different methods or different routes. This reactive approach guarantees that authorities will always be one step behind criminal innovation. The international implications are equally troubling. Mexican cartels have proven they can systematically infiltrate and exploit American infrastructure despite billions spent on border security. This success has attracted attention from other criminal organizations worldwide who see similar opportunities in different transportation networks. What we're witnessing isn't just a smuggling operation. It's a fundamental challenge to national sovereignty. Foreign criminal organizations have successfully weaponized American infrastructure against American citizens, and traditional law enforcement approaches have proven inadequate to address this threat. The ghost train network represents the future of organized crime, sophisticated, adaptive, and deeply integrated into legitimate systems. These operations blur the line between criminal activity and legitimate commerce in ways that make detection incredibly difficult and disruption potentially catastrophic to normal economic activity. But there's something even more disturbing about this story. The very success of these operations demonstrates how vulnerable American infrastructure really is. If criminal organizations can so completely infiltrate and exploit the freight rail system, what other critical infrastructure might be equally vulnerable to similar attacks? The cartels have shown that with enough planning, resources, and intelligence gathering, foreign actors can turn America's greatest strengths, its vast transportation networks and open commerce, into weapons against American security. This lesson isn't lost on other adversaries who might have different objectives but similar capabilities. Tonight, as you sleep safely in your homes, dozens of trains are crossing the Mexican border carrying cargo that will determine whether American families live or die. Some of those trains carry the grain that feeds our nation and the goods that power our economy. Others carry poison disguised as medicine, death disguised as commerce. The ghost train network continues operating because it represents the perfect criminal enterprise: high profits, distributed risk, and exploitation of systems too complex and too important to shut down. Until American authorities develop strategies that match the sophistication of cartel operations, these trains will keep rolling north, carrying their deadly cargo into the heart of America. The war on drugs has found a new battlefield, and it's rolling on steel rails through your neighborhood, The question isn't whether cartels will continue using ghost trains to smuggle drugs. It's whether America has the will and capability to stop them before this network becomes too powerful to dismantle. This is the hidden war being fought in rail yards and border crossings, in federal courtrooms and corporate boardrooms. It's a war where the battlefield is measured in miles of track. The weapons are welding torches and X-ray machines, and the stakes are nothing less than America's future. The ghost trains are real, they're operating right now, and they represent the most sophisticated threat to American security that most citizens will never see coming.